SOPs, and just letting you know as well, my name is Ullrich Loeffler. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Ecosystm, so I've got the pleasure to facilitate the next session. I just wanted to say SOPs is available later on a panel at 4 p.m. as well, so if you have any questions around anything that he shared, please stick around, and we've got an open floor to address some of them. I also wanted to say, when I saw the video of the FinTech Festival, I had the pleasure or the honor of attending the last one in 2018, and I've got to say it's pretty mind-blowing. And I think last year was 45,000 people. This year I heard 60 or 70,000. So you really have got to be there. So if you can make it happen, I would really encourage you to come up to Singapore. Another one for later, we heard from SOPs on some of the initiatives happening in Singapore. We also have some other great speakers from Singapore who made their way down to New Zealand. One is actually a Kiwi, Jared McKenzie, who leads the innovation and transformation for one of the largest banks in Singapore. So we hear as well what he's doing, and obviously has from a banking perspective as well, maybe some encouraging words on what fintechs can do in the engagements with some of the large banks. We also heard earlier a lot about data, and especially when we talk about AI or leveraging the data economy, we first of all need to have the data to build our algorithms on top of that. So I'm really pleased not to lead into a panel where we want to talk about innovation based on trusted data. And to lead into the panel, I would like to introduce Dr. David Hardoon, who's a special advisor for artificial intelligence at the Monetary Authority of Singapore. He calls himself a data artist rather than a data scientist, which I think is a very nice angle of the AI part. He previously was the chief data officer at MAS, but he is now driving the AI strategy and collaboration strategy for the Singapore government. So please welcome Dr. David Hardoon.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks for that embarrassing plug. Yeah, I call myself a data artist for those two reasons that I mentioned earlier, that I still find the whole idea about data scientists just bizarre, given the fact that all scientists use data, even philosophers. But anyway, so as I was mentioning earlier, kind of using AI in a more ubiquitous term, I want to kind of take a step back and talk about data, because with all the conversation that we're having about facilitating the digital economy, fintech, startups, etc., and so forth, it all situates on the feasibility and the usability of data, be it from data moving across organizations, within organization, across country, and so forth. And if we fundamentally are keen and interested in facilitating what we call as the digital economy, data has to flow. I mean, imagine a scenario whereby having such abilities of storing, processing, aggregating, or even transmitting data cannot happen. It's entirely antithesis to that of a digital economy. And one of the comments there from the Economies is that the world's most valuable resource is no longer oil, but data. And one of those, I don't know if any of you watched Dune, but the spice must flow. In this case, data must flow. So why we're talking about this and why we're doing this? And it's actually a really interesting thing, given the fact that in Singapore currently, there actually is no limitations in terms of data flow and data usage. As long as obviously the requirements of a secure environment, privacy and so forth is maintained. I take that as a hygiene, as a given. But as we all know, sometimes not saying you can do something results in a lot of organizations still not doing it. And if we look globally, oh, my slides are not moving. There is an underlying degree of various localization of data. From your non, which actually I'm very happy and proud to say Singapore sits within, all the way to the very strong requirements. And literally on top of my head, to give you some example, strong will obviously, for example, be your China. And until a day or 2 days ago, if indeed is true and not a typo error, Indonesia. And as Sops was just mentioning earlier, they're fundamentally kind of reversed from requiring the very strong localization of data for financial sector, or in fact all sectors, to now saying that any private business in fact can do the processing of data overseas with the exception of government-related data. And again, if in true, I've only found it in the Jakarta Times, it is a fundamental and phenomenal change. All the way to kind of from a de facto, which ironically is very interesting because I never thought it was intended to be that, is the EU and GDPR. It's kind of resulted in, from a business point of view, localizing EU kind of citizen-based data in the EU. India, Brazil, Argentina, Canada, on a specific segment. So in the end of the day, you're seeing this kind of degree of portfolio. Now, when discussing with financial institutions, or vast majority, it's never just a one-country business. It's a multinational, multi-institutional type of organization. And that's why I said that even not having any localization of data results in an operating process of kind of working at the highest or higher of by saying, we can't have data going. And in fact, one of the biggest complaints I get, complaints or comments from tech companies, when I ask them, what is your challenges when you're working with fintech players, saying, I'm contracted to do a job for them, but they won't give me the data. And I always wonder, how does that even work? So you're paying someone to just look and kind of jump around it. So you're seeing, we need to move against this. As I mentioned earlier, if we really and fundamentally are trying to fulfill and establish a digital economy, this needs to happen. And I was just talking to someone the other day, and I was thinking, if you really go to a full strong, how do you send emails? Because that kind of moves between countries as well. So an example of kind of from a status quo as to why there's the need for it. And to be really honest, it's really interesting kind of putting this together. It also happens within organization, but now it's from a cross-institutional, cross-sovereignty perspective, where you may have multiple locations, data sitting there, and there are kind of two views that I take of it. Naturally, coming from a regulator, I look at it from a risk perspective. Where currently you may have a scenario whereby you're aggregating risk for country A, aggregating risk for country B, and so forth, and then submitting it to the home regulator. But then that fundamentally is a different view. If you had the ability to analyze based on an entity or even based on an individual, cross the locations. Now that's one point of view. Naturally, there's immense possibilities on the services side if you have an ability of how I perform. Just because I moved from Singapore to New Zealand doesn't change me as a person in the type of services I'm interested in. Or, of course, from a tech company perspective, if there's an inability of working across these locations, you need to physically be in every single one of these locations. So how to effectively go about in managing from your financial crimes, and again, I have a massive biasness to that, coming from the regulatory perspective, all the way to the services, marketing, and the engagement. We need to think differently. We need to see how we situate around an activity, around an entity, around an individual, independent of the location. There you go. Now, there's various approaches that, in fact, we have been exploring in Singapore, and I think across the board, in terms of addressing it. So the first one is, being a tech person, obviously a technical solution. And the kind of three things that we've experimented are in terms of, it's actually quite interesting, you know, if a tree falls in the forest, but you can't see the tree, you can't even see the forest, has the tree fall down? So this was basically being a smart ass and said, okay, so I can't move data across borders. Can we still analyze data without moving the data across borders? So various kinds of techniques, homomorphic encryption, tokenization, multi-party secure computation, as well as federated analytics, where the whole idea is that data that's really sensitive and moving about, can we think of ways in effectively making it meaningless for layman person point of view, but still allows us to analyze it, still allows us to achieve certain outcomes from it. A recent pilot, and this is public, that was done by UOB and MAS and the Bank of Thailand were observers, where it's quite interesting is on the federated analytics, where the analytical algorithm goes to the data rather than data going to the algorithm, and then the outcome comes back. But as you can imagine, while there are these technological solutions and approaches in dealing with this issue of data flow effectively, there are two underlying issues still. One is you need to train up people. It's new tech. Even just people always ask, like, what the hell is homomorphic encryption and so forth? How do you deal with it? And then, of course, there's that legal challenge that's on top of it. Because A, as I gave the analogy about the tree falling in the forest but no one sees it, well, even though you're not moving the original data or if you change the form, something is still moving. Does it pass the legal threshold? Or the fact that there's always that requirement that there's 0% likelihood of being reinterpreted. Now, we all know there's never 100% likelihood of not reinterpreting it. So does it pass the legal barrier associated with it? But still exploring, still needs to be done. Concurrently to that, and that's what we've been advocating over the last, I would say, nearly a year in Singapore, dealing it across organizations and across countries, New Zealand included, is how do we take our trade agreements and upgrade them effectively? Really thinking with a digital economy in the mindset of every folks. So how do we create an environment whereby a financial institution in country A and a company located B, or it could be even the same financial institution in country B, does not need to have that physical connectivity, physically in the presence in the same country to do whatever analysis? So I'll give you an example. You may have an NLP-based company, natural language processing company based in New Zealand that's providing services to an OCBC or DBS or UOB in Singapore. And not having the necessity of saying, well, you need to uplift, go all the way to Singapore to providing that underlying service, because at the end of the day, you contracted to do that. How do we facilitate that? And how do we provide that comfort to the financial institutions that it's kosher, and also for the tech companies? Now, at the same time, is providing those safeguards for the regulators that this is indeed data that is Singapore data and I have the access to it whenever I need it. So it's really thinking differently, or not so differently, because we've had embassies for, well, quite some time, if not millennia. Same idea in a digital concept. In fact, and again, to give you a concrete example, but I don't think it's still been ratified, if you look at the Canadian, US, Mexican trade agreement, that's exactly the wording that's in those agreements. They've moved from, I think it was the US Treasury, from how can we allow data that's critical for the US economy to be sitting not in the US, to actually can sit anyway as long as we, from a regulatory perspective, have the ability to access it and it's protected. That's the way we need to start thinking. That's the way we need to start moving effectively. And that's what we're advocating. That's what we're driving. In allowing and facilitating the growth. And I was just having a conversation outside talking about talent and facilitating talent across the world. Even if you've taken everyone who does data science, everyone who does AI, and stacked them up all together, that's still not enough people globally to address the demand that's available. So we need to start thinking in the way that how do we truly proliferate, how do we truly allow for the facilitation to leverage on all the data assets that we have through the people and the organizations out there. Because quite frankly, and this is also the coming of age for a lot of the legacy systems and legacy or brick and mortar organizations, we don't collect data to just hug it at night and feel good about it. There needs to be an underlying value and an outcome that comes from it. The honest truth is, and this is kind of, I always kind of say with a smile when I speak to compliance people at financial institutions, saying, the only reason you collect data is because I made you, from a regulatory perspective. But now we need to change that. Think about that data that's being collected, how to use it and how to leverage it. Oh, I think that's my last, oh yeah, it's my slide. So just to wrap up, even though in Singapore, as I mentioned, we're at the bottom of the pillar and we don't actually require any of these agreements, and actually going to one of the points that Sub was mentioning earlier about the sandbox, I don't know it's about whether it's doing things that we don't need to do, but it's about providing that comfort and familiarity for both financial institutions as well as tech players that even though I don't need to do this agreement, even though I don't need to have this because you can just go ahead and do it, I'm providing you that safety in terms of you can do it. You can facilitate this. You can provide these underlying services. Going down the path of advocating and driving that innovation. And it's again hand to hand in terms of the mantra and the approach that from an MAS and in Singapore as a whole we take, is that innovation and regulations are not contradictory to one another. There's always this prevailing view that for innovation you have to downplay regulation, or if you have regulations you don't achieve innovation. It's that the fundamentally good regulation allows a proliferation of innovation. And this is one aspect that we're trying to fulfill from Singapore point of view. So, thanks.
Thank you, David. Don't move too fast, so you can stay. If you want to maybe just take a seat here at the front. So we want to lead now into an open panel or discussion, so take the handheld. And I would like to introduce or invite the other panelists to join us on stage. So first of all, Emilie Fetscher, the co-founder and director of Stratamap. If you could, Emilie, yeah, could come to the front. Bernard De Rey, the co-founder and group CEO of Capital Preference. And also from Thailand, Stanley Wang, the managing director of Illuminati. So if you could please come on stage as well. So we're going to keep this interactive again and let you ask most of the questions, but considering that I spent a little bit of time preparing for this panel, I don't want to let this get to waste. So I might maybe kick it off. And we heard from David your background and your thoughts already. It would be maybe good to, for the other panelists to get maybe a minute each to introduce them and their business a little bit more, and especially the relevance to this topic on driving digital economies on trusted data. So if we can maybe start with Stanley from the back.
Yes, for those of you that are not familiar, what we are involved in is the use of natural language processing, NLP, to convert unstructured text into usable data. In particular, our use case right now is in the anti-money laundering CFT space. Just to give a little bit more of a sense of what that involves, is what we do is we process a very heterogeneous multi-source information, which includes everything from investigations to news reports to press releases to et cetera. And we convert that directly into data that can be consumed by machines and by humans to improve anti-money laundering processes and workflows.
Thank you, Stanley. And Bernard?
Bernard Del Rey. I'm a New Yorker in New Zealand. Been here for 4 years and co-founded a company called Capital Preferences. And we're an enterprise platform that helps financial services firms understand how their customers make decisions with money. So things like risk profiling a consumer to understand how much risk they're willing to take, or understanding what their true priorities are. And we do that built upon an economics framework that evaluates the utility that they derive from different decisions in their financial life. We think that's important because financial well-being is a personal journey. There's certain things that obviously you can say about society and that are normative for people to do, saving more, but how much risk you want to take, what your priorities are in life, those are unique to you as an individual, and really uncovering those is the core responsibility of financial services firms as they provide advice on financial products. We operate in the US, the UK, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, and later this quarter in China. So we're caught in the middle of all of this data, consumer privacy, working with financial institutions, and sometimes I feel like I now deserve an honorary international law degree from all of that work, and we'll talk more about that, I hope.
And Emilie?
Emilie Fetscher from Stratamap. We exist to promote global collaboration on modeling complexity, and specifically we work in the information security space. We've been working with New Zealand-based institutions, financial institutions, telcos, and health orgs to model their risk across multiple standards and effectively multiple jurisdictions to bring down that cost of compliance and help to identify gaps across some of those different standards and markets. Ultimately, trying to move from that compliance-centered tick box approach to an assurance model where we understand where we're at any point in time and how we can adapt more quickly to new markets or to innovation.
Okay, thank you. I would maybe kick it off with Bernard. You mentioned that you deserve an honorable law degree. So you've quite a bit of experience as navigating localization or data localization laws. The first question, I think, to my perspective, what David presented is quite logical. It makes a lot of sense. But first was the question: do we agree that there is actually a problem that we need to address, or could we at least generate more value if data was more freely available across different jurisdictions?
Thanks for the question. I think it's to put it in perspective, our number one spend in a very small company on relative terms is obviously tech, but the second is legal. And I'm writing checks, certainly bigger than my salary, to law firms each month in the U.S. and in the U.K. and soon in China and Singapore and other jurisdictions, just to navigate the complexity of what is a customer, what is private information, what is the ability to process that information, where can it go thereafter, and often, perfect example, major U.S. firm who's operating in the U.K., they say, you're not subject to GDPR, and our attorneys say, we are subject to GDPR. That conversation alone, which lasts 45 minutes, just put $4,000 bill in my pocket to pay. And so these are very real issues as it relates to startups, and certainly for export of services out of New Zealand, we would benefit tremendously, I think, from having uniformity and also transparency in the views and protocols related to data sharing. So whoever solves that problem, gets a giant New York hug from me.
No, thank you. David, you mentioned that there's obviously different solutions, whether technology or more, on a government relationship point of view. So if you're looking at or hearing a story like Bernard, and I'm pretty sure like a lot of other people in the room can relate to that, what can the industry do to actually drive this forward, or do we need to sit back and wait for the governments to basically get the wheels in motion, or can the industry do something to fast track this?
Yeah, no, definitely. And I just wanted to add that I think one of the core things, and perhaps it's my own love affair with evil lawyers, is the necessity of clarity. But yeah, I think there's definitely one of the biggest challenges, at least I kind of saw in dealing with these conversations with multiple jurisdictions, is usually the biggest complaint comes from financial institutions, and the biggest complaint is, it costs me a lot of money. While that is a very legitimate complaint, because obviously if you do the numbers and the math, you realize that eventually the person who pays is the consumer. But the concern with that is that a lot of times from a pure regulatory perspective, it's just translated to, oh, that's the cost of doing business. So two things I really think would be immensely beneficial from the industry at large. One is not just saying it's a cost element, or taking that extra mile of saying, well, this is what the cost means to you. And having that understanding from the regulatory perspective that, look, we really need to start thinking about it, because just, talking about AML, just throwing more people doesn't solve the problem. Then the second one is, it is so much more than just cost. In fact, I came from a round table on this topic in Japan, and other than the fact that it cost this particular institution $40 million to replicate the entire operations, he says, well, actually, that's my least of my concerns. My concerns is I can't hire enough security experts in this new locations to make sure that the cyber hygiene that I need to is maintained. So you see, there's a lot of red flags. So all of these need to be put together to really help elevate that point that, look, if we're really after security, we're really after privacy, these can be achieved while allowing data to flow. I mean, to me, I personally can't understand why this is seen as a contradiction.
Emilie, I saw you nodding quite a bit. Is there, from your perspective, obviously working on the compliance side, I mean, I wish companies quite a bit. What is your perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. And what you said earlier as well, that the only reason that a lot of these data is collected is because a regulator has asked for it. And so we start to say, what would the world look like if we could actually not just have that data flow, but have that risk and assurance model flow across borders, so that we're not responding to each of those jurisdictions, but instead the jurisdictions can understand how the entity is responding to that risk profile. And we also give that transparency back to the business, so that we're doing the right thing, because those regulations are usually in place to protect us as consumers and to protect that value that we're trying to create.
Yeah. Stanley, actually David in his short presentation gave an example, like a company providing NLP services, in one side of the world to customers in another side, and obviously, not having to pack up or set up business in other geographies. Your company actually provides NLP services. So how do you address this challenge currently, or do you just use different sources of data to get around it?
Yeah, actually, I sort of have 2 points. I was very struck by what Sapnandu had mentioned regarding the sort of unbundling of services. It is interesting from a regulatory standpoint that compliance is not an unbundled service yet, and may or may never be. But I think that it is still considered sort of core a banking function. And therefore the cost duplication of this is really, I think, what the challenge banks face, which is that every bank has to essentially establish their own regime. Living with that and accepting that as the status quo, the way that we're approaching this is by trying to bring external information that is useful in terms of being able to do the compliance analysis, the AML, fraud detection, the money laundering detection into the banking environment. But having, and that's really sort of the approach we're taking. We're building fairly complex NLP models which are not based on very specifically defined text, but really being able to process everything from press releases to investigative reports to news articles, etc., extracting that information, organizing it, and allowing banks to consume that. But sort of from an innovation standpoint, if you look at it, about 15% of run-the-bank costs is going towards regulatory compliance. Yeah. And I think there is perhaps a need to re-examine whether or not some of that can be serviced out in a way to specialists that can address them in a more appropriate manner and reduce that, because I think some numbers I saw, about $80 billion in payroll and $20 billion in tech is spent on global compliance annually, and that's something that is a pretty big number.
Yeah.
Can I
yeah.
I think that's an extremely important point, and maybe it wasn't mentioned earlier. And I see the connectivity because fundamentally, whether it's within a country, an organization, cross-border, there's that fundamental necessity of almost from an infrastructure point of view, the data can move. And then on top of it is those services, and in fact that unbundling is an important criteria within it, that in fact has started, because it is a mindset change, specifically in Singapore. So just to share, we're having a massive rehaul of one of our regulatory compliance reports. And so let's say going from something like, I can't remember the exact number, like 40,000 attributes are being collected to 450,000. So significant. And what we also realize, and why all of these things come together, is because the financial sector is a very kind of asymmetrical line in terms of you have a few very large players or mature players who can go and do stuff, and then you have a lot of long tail. That even if you kind of say, gun to their head and say, like, no, you have to do it locally, you have to build this yourself, saying, I can't. And then it comes because the whole aspect of cost of operation. I mean, not that there are many, even, let's say, with the de facto implication, let's say GDPR, resulted in a few people just saying, packing up and saying, look, I can't operate, I can't deal with it. So what I just wanted to plug in about that in terms of regulatory compliance is that actually there is that change that's coming. And specifically in Singapore, what we've done is we're encouraging what we call managed service providers for broadly called RegTech. And to, no pun intended, putting our money where our mouth is, there's a granting scheme that will support financial institutions to use the services of the managed service providers. And one of the requirements is the cloud-based.
Okay, I'll talk to you.
So that's in place already, or is this in plan?
It's rolling out. It's basically, it's an overarching umbrella in terms of digitalization, where it's everything from anything. But I just wanted to specifically home on the compliance side, because I fully agree that, again, it's a mindset. If we want to fundamentally, as an economy, as an ecosystem, really level everyone up, there's a need to level everyone up.
Yeah. I want to obviously open it up to the floor. So if you've got a question, there's a floating microphone somewhere going around there. But I also wanted to check from David's perspective. Obviously, the fintech sector is one, or the finance sector is one of the most regulated ones. So it's one of the hardest ones to probably get this in place, but it's also the one which could have the most impact because financial transactions underlie every other industry, and also every trade has a financial transaction on the back of it. So do you see any kind of examples where other industries or maybe have put something similar in place already, maybe in an easier starting point because it's not as heavily regulated, or?
Well, and just to add to what you're saying, I think it's also the industry that has the most incorrect perceptions with respect to what can and can't be done in terms of interpretations. Because a lot of things that actually are allowed to be done, but there's that kind of risk averse of like, we're just not going to do it. I don't know. I mean, the only one I can think of is really the healthcare sector. But I would say that actually sometimes the financial sector is even more perceptually regulated than the healthcare one.
Yeah.
I think one of from a risk perspective, I think particularly with respect to sanctions evasion, CFT, and AML, unfortunately, that from a regulatory perspective, that is actually truly border, and so the penalties do not, even if Singapore is a very open regime from the standpoint of innovation, ultimately the penalties that come out of the U.S. from OFAC or et cetera do fall on you no matter what. So it really is a lowest common denominator, reality. We're starting from maybe the perspective of trying the easiest part of data sharing is maybe to start with data that isn't actually siloed to begin with, but basically to try to convert that into something that can be used on a common platform as a first step. But I think that nonetheless, this is an area where regulatory expansion and the number of obliged parties has expanded tremendously, and they are not at all, I think, in a state of preparedness to be able to comply with a lot of the new regulation that is coming into place. Very easy to write regulation. It is not easy to comply.
Yeah. I think there's a question here in the middle.
Hello, David. You're a very enthusiastic data person. Security, the other side of the coin. The forecast is that cybercrime is going to be worth $6 trillion by 2024. Capital One was breached for 100 million records. Every single one of those people records as a person who's affected. Don't you think that the compliance side of the equation is to protect lives rather than simply stop you from sharing data?
No, absolutely. But you see, and that's why I meant it. Again, it's maybe a personal point of view, but I think we're lying to ourselves when we're keeping data locally that it's any more secure or any more safe. So effectively, it's the perception of, and that's why I mentioned earlier that look, security has to be an underlying hygiene. Obviously, if there's no secure, don't do it. So that's the starting point. But fundamentally, given the fact of the amount of investment, the amount of research, the amount of technology we've put into online security, there's a strong belief that it is possible to have data flowing cross borders in a way that's compliant also from a security standpoint of view, as well as from a privacy perspective. It may not be easy, but it should be done and it should be attempted to do that. Does that mean that there won't be incidents? Look, there will always be a risk associated with it, but then that's why there should be equivalent investment in making sure the safeguards and the rails in place to achieve that.
Okay, just going back to Capital One, that was their third breach. This was one that happened 2 months ago in 5 years. So they're not obviously learning the lesson. So the data that's being protected, or should be being protected, isn't. So surely the security factor should be built with the data enablement which you're talking about.
No, absolutely. But I'm saying that think of it as two underlying layers. And the reason I'm saying it's two underlying layers is because a lot of times data is convoluted in terms of, from a security point of view, from a trust perspective, from a flow and so forth. To do security properly, we need to look at security properly and making sure how can we make sure that from a breach point of view, from a leakage perspective, from a siphoning, whatever all the issues, they can be addressed to the maximum point of view. But what I meant in terms of that we're lying to ourselves is, for example, when I spoke to some of the chief security officers, cybersecurity officers in financial institutions, they're saying, look, my zero-day breaches are on an average of 200 to 300 days. It's not that they don't happen, you just don't know that they're happening. So actually the fact that we know that Kegel has been breached 3 times, actually I think that's a great thing because you actually know it and you're able to interrupt it and do something about it. So it's really about those two aspects of it. But I actually take your point, and that's why if you look at the box, security has to be a hygiene and a fundamental, but it shouldn't be an element by saying, oh, no, to achieve security, we don't have a data flow. It doesn't make sense.
I mean, as a non-specialist, I also tend to agree that it's the data concentration of records. It's not the flow of data actually that poses the greater risk. If you look at the history of the big sort of data breaches, they're not really, I think, related to the exchange of data. It is the data at rest that is concentrated in centralized locations. Okay, wherever that happens to be, that is actually where the bulk of the risk actually resides.
Yeah. There's one question here at the front. The question actually from a security point of view is also like, who has actually the mandate on keeping it secure? Because if you've got a trade agreement between two countries, like would it be a joint effort between both countries, or would there be a independent institution who kind of like needs to be put in place, or what kind of scenario could work there on with regards to the data ownership as well as the mandate to keep it safe? And I'm sure Bernard, if you've got a view on that.
Yeah, I mean, I just might comment, having doing business with customers that have 20 million customers or 35 million customers. They already they institute very rigorous info security protocols on us as vendors, and they want us to have obviously as little data on their end customers so that they're not personally identifiable in any way. Where I think there could be further innovation is in the area of just standardizing an information security review process for vendors that do interact with because the UK bank info security process might take me 6 months and $30,000 to jump through, and then the US asset manager one might be a couple of flavors might be different, but it's thematically the same. So things like CIS controls and these other kind of standards for data security, I think, are going that way. But just encouraging the monetary authority to the degree those types of issues can be addressed globally. That is another major point of friction, and just both securing data and also allowing innovation to flow more quickly and cutting down innovation life cycles.
Okay, I think we've got a question here at the front.
Yeah, probably it's the elephant in the room, I think, around digital identity. Is the Singaporean system is a centralized one. You have one number for a citizen, and in terms of the New Zealand Privacy Act, that's against our regulations. Public services or public organisations can't share identity systems across services. They all have to have separate identity systems, and sort of the follow on to that is who owns the data, how do you store the data, and kind of the direction that the world we're kind of moving in is more around decentralization or user ownership of data, and then this shared infrastructure, which is like what's envisaged by SOPs and the API exchange, which is the sort of next step where you don't store the data unless you only use the data for a purpose, and then it's gone because it's all encrypted. So just interested in probably the data artists, David, your thoughts and where it's going and how we reconcile New Zealand and Singaporean law in that area.
I was eagerly going to look around and say, I just want to pick it up. Maybe I'll give actually an example, because I may not have the full answer for that. But so even though in Singapore we have a national identity, NIRC, as we call it, and even though as a regulator I have all the legal power to collect it in the clear, I don't need it and I don't want to. So we actually will be testing a technology that fundamentally allows to have different ID information from institutions that allows you to combine it. So given that, and I see Sob is jumping up the talk, but actually an idea that may be even of interest, because look, ultimately there is an organization in New Zealand that has the power to do it. It is the government. In the end of the day, in terms of being a central point that says, well, look, every single one of you has a different record. You can have ability that's an encrypted form, a tokenized representation that allows to have a link between these two underlying individuals in providing a very specific service. So that's one way of thinking about it. But at the end of the day, it's the end objective that we're trying to achieve. Or saying, well, no, absolutely, we don't want to have an ability of having a service that transcends an ability that provides a digital service for an individual. So there needs to be a landing point. So in my view, a lot of times from this privacy perspective, it's just making sure that from a privacy point of view of protection, it's maintained. And I believe that it's possible to do that while having a secure tokenization of that provides that connectivity effectively of that individual across the different institutions. Again, not an entire answer. There's a lot of technical challenges there, and obviously a legal one.
I was asking, can I have access to internet? I could have shown you live how the whole process works right now. But anyway, there's an afternoon session, I'll show it. I think the reason I want to show it live because it's important to understand how this whole process operates. First thing, I think the Privacy Data Protection Act is equally rigorous in Singapore than like any other country. But we have to go on a principle of consent-based architecture, which means all of us have right to choose what data we want to share, provided we have a consent system which allows us to track and measure and follow that consent. When we constructed the whole MyInfo, which is our national registry for trusted data, is not a single source or a single database of all data. It actually goes real-time, pulls data from 11 government, or maybe around 11, 10 government agencies database real-time. So there's no concentration of data sitting in one place to start with. Second thing is that this is driven by your national identity and a consent, and there are a lot of principles we follow, what we call don't over-consent, which means I should not be collecting data which I don't need. So there are a lot of thinking has gone behind how each sector authorizes respective sector to understand what data they must extract from the national registry through the customer consent to come to respective sector. Now, there's something called API exchange we are building. Now, why an API exchange? Because there are two schools of thought. There's an open banking, if you understand the open banking, UK open banking and open banking mandate out there, who is the policymakers legislated saying that banks must open data to third party if customer choose to take out. We have followed a different approach in Singapore. We thought that best way to address the same outcome of open data is to build the right infrastructure. And that is the reason why in Singapore, first we went and built a trusted national data gateway called MyInfo. As we speak, we are building for the first sector, this financial sector, an API exchange. What it means, all the banks, insurance company, provident fund company are going to publish their respective data of what they create for the customer through this trusted national data exchange, API exchange gateway. And as a first phase, if I have a bank account with a bank and I have holdings in an insurance company and the bank, through my bank I can use through national API exchange gateway authorized to pull all the data and see a consolidated financial holding. We're also looking at allowing a third party in the later phase where with consent a third party can pull data through the national data exchange. Why it is important for a country like Singapore is because we want to ensure the data source is trusted. It has got proper governance principle, and we should have proper monitoring of what data we have been passing to the gateway to respective third party, and also for future new data creation. And I think that's perhaps a very thoughtful way to go about addressing some of the questions around privacy, questions around data security, concentration of data in one place, and in future cross-border exchange. Now I want to quickly come back to the question asked David on the data corridor. If New Zealand, and it's all hypothetical, I'll take my liberty from my government officials other side. If we have a similar platform in New Zealand, imagine a Kiwi customer going to Singapore and they can open a bank account by just calling an API from a trusted data exchange from New Zealand. Similarly, a Singaporean coming here can open a bank account by just calling an API from MyInfo using SyncPass. A trusted data gets to a banking system. Now, both the country very trust each other. There's a trusted data corridor, there's trusted architecture, and the trusted golden source at a respective jurisdiction. That immediately opens up the whole data corridor, that opens up the data economy, that opens the whole data trade. So I think for both countries to build a trusted data corridor must have some discussion around common infrastructure, common principles, and trusted data platforms. Sorry, long. I just want to, I want to ensure the data corridor discussion gets anchored before we move on.
I just wanted to say that the whole idea of data sovereignty, data privacy is a myth. The horse has left long ago. You know, everybody has your data in some form, and the idea that somehow you can get control of that back, I think is just we're fooling ourselves today. I think we just have to live with that, you know, the reality of that. To be honest with you, and maybe that's not the right thing, to say. But
I think that's the challenge, because if you believe the data is not moved, it's a myth. You can live on the rest of the life, but if you can take proactive action, you can make it better.
We're pretty much at the end of the time for this panel as well. We could, if there's one urgent, immediate question, especially after Sob's comments, anyone wants to throw one in? Otherwise, I want to thank
Well,
Emilie.
maybe just before that, and I think, just very, very briefly, just to anchor, and it's actually a combination of a lot of the points that were mentioned earlier. I think the first starting point is there need to be a change of mindset. And we understandably still think in a very analog point of view, with the things that we're very accustomed and how we're operating. And what we've been doing is we've been translating these traditional, legacy, customary, even legal perspectives, or even points of view in terms of privacy, into the digital world. And we need to fundamentally start changing them. So there are ways in addressing aspects of privacy. The fact that different financial institutions or different institutions have different records in identifying the customer, but still there has to be a unique golden source, which, I mean, the government still knows who you are. And going back to that point, is governments always seem to have this very tendency of being whiter than white. And saying, look, no, we know who you are. We want to provide an underlying service, but then how can we do it in a way that provides privacy? And it can be done through underlying technology. How to provide a view in terms of clarity in those processes, be it across jurisdictions or even within the same jurisdiction, and then how to make sure there's a maximization utilizing of the data. These are fundamental capacities that are needed, and it all starts with thinking, we need to start thinking differently and to achieve that. Does it address everything, cybersecurity and all that? No, but risk, as I unfortunately keep on reminding my supervisors, will never be zero. And if we always operate in achieving a perfect solution or have zero risk, we'll never achieve anything. It's about taking those incremental steps, right mindset, connectivity, and, well, working with the end in mind to a certain respect.
Yeah. And the status quo is not providing zero risk either, so as we heard from all the breaches before. So I just want to thank Emilie, Bernard, obviously David, and Stanley as well for sharing their stories and wisdom. We're heading into lunch break now, which I think goes on to 1:10 if I'm correct. Please stick around. I said we've got quite a few different stories to tell afterwards as well. I heard we're just hearing a panel, sorry, a live demo later as well from SOPs if we get the internet working. So it's worthwhile staying for that alone. And also wanted to say again, there is this booth from the ABS outside for the FinTech Festival. So if you are interested in coming to Singapore in November, there are some special packages for flights and accommodation. Also, the New Zealand or NZTE is actually having quite a significant contingency. It's this New Zealand pavilion. There will be a lot of FinTech companies being present, and also some more to travel up. I think there's a full week of different functions and discussions and different opportunities to collaborate. So if you are interested, take this opportunity as well to maybe go next door and check out what the options are to still make your way up to Singapore in November. Amit, yeah, one comment.
Look, I just wanted to add there was some questions earlier in the day about capital raising and fundraising and stuff, and we know that Singapore is number one or number two globally in terms of FDIs into Singapore and foreign direct investments out of Singapore. There is going to be a lot of discussion around the capital piece. I think Swapnendu, we've got the panel, and we'd love for you to share some of those examples of what New Zealand companies can do, and how do you work on that capital raising process. I also wanted to highlight there was a question around working with Singapore government. There's a question to Enterprise Singapore to whoever in, but there is a counterpart of Callaghan Innovation in Singapore called SG Innovate. It's actually, believe it or not, it actually has a co-founder, and the co-founder is the former CEO of IMDA, which is the Infocom Media Development Authority of Singapore, Steve Leonard. And Steve they're very vocal about the fact that they don't limit their funding to Singapore companies. They look at funding opportunities with any great startups that they see opportunities with, as long as they're focused on deep tech. They're happy to support those, so definitely worth having conversations around what Singapore can do in that funding space as well. So we'll look forward to more discussion around that. Yeah, and if you want to watch what Steve Leonard has to say about funding through Singapore, you can actually go on Ecosystem TV. It's on our Ecosystem app or the website, and there is an interview with Steve Leonard, and he shares a lot more about what SG Innovate does to support not just companies from overseas, but also working with funds coming in to invest further into these companies, and they can come from anywhere. Thank you, and thanks for your time, and enjoy lunch, and we'll see you guys after that.